She was just 17. No weapon, no uniform, just an apron and a quiet hope to help her family. When Elizabeth Kalhammer answered a small newspaper ad for a housekeeping job in the Alps, she believed she'd be scrubbing floors at a peaceful mountain inn. Instead, she stepped through the gates of the most secretive and sinister stronghold in Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler's private alpine fortress, the Berghof. For almost 80 years, Elizabeth stayed silent. No memoirs, no interviews. Not even her closest friends or family knew the full truth. But now, at the age of 99, she's finally ready to speak. And what she reveals is rewriting the final chapter of Hitler's rule. She witnessed things no textbook ever described: midnight arguments behind sealed doors, uniforms covered in ash, and staff who vanished overnight, never to return. She served. Tea down the hallway from whispered orders about mass extermination. She watched a dictator unravel, not in battle but in silence. Paranoid, drugged, and spiraling out of control. She remembers Eva Braun drifting through those marble corridors. Like royalty, draped in stolen jewels, giving quiet commands with a polished smile. Kalhammer once ran through smoke as the Berghof caught fire, heart pounding, the mountain air choked with ash and fear. There were no explanations, no protections, no way out. Elizabeth had to survive in a world where asking questions could mean disappearing forever. Every whisper she heard, every scream she pretended not to notice, became part of the history she carried alone. Why was a teenage maid allowed so close to the most dangerous man in Europe? What did she see that made her stay quiet for nearly a lifetime? And what do her memories reveal about the final days of the Nazi regime, when power, fear, and delusion collided behind closed doors? This isn't history filtered through propaganda or polished speeches. This is history as it really happened, told by someone who cleaned its silverware, polished its looted paintings, and saw its darkest moments firsthand. She didn't wear a uniform. She didn't hold a rank. But Elizabeth Kalhammer stood at the heart of history, surrounded by men who shaped the fate of millions. She didn't read about it. She lived it. This is Elizabeth Kalhammer, the maid who witnessed Hitler's collapse. In 1943, Elizabeth Kalhammer saw a simple job ad in a Salzburg newspaper. Maid wanted. Location: Berghof, Obersalzberg. No details, no warnings. No mention that Berghof was the personal mountain retreat of Adolf Hitler. To a teenager trying to support her war-stricken family, it sounded like a quiet housekeeping job in a remote village. Fresh air, clean sheets, mountains. Within days, Elizabeth boarded a train, then a military vehicle. As they climbed into the Bavarian Alps, the scenery grew surreal. Postcard-perfect peaks, endless forests, and a silence that felt too thick. But the real shock came at the gates. Not one checkpoint, not two, three, each guarded by heavily armed SS soldiers. These weren't protective guards for a guest house. These were war machines wrapped in flesh. And suddenly, Elizabeth realized she wasn't stepping into a home. She was entering a fortress. The Berghof was perched high above Berchtesgaden, camouflaged by beauty. From the outside, it looked like a luxury chalet, complete with massive picture windows and a sweeping view of the Alps. But beneath the luxury was something far darker. This was not just Hitler's vacation home. It was one of the command centers of the Nazi regime. Hitler spent more time here than almost anywhere else during the war. His generals came and went. Plans for invasions were debated just rooms away from where Elizabeth folded napkins. Inside, silence wasn't just a suggestion, it was enforced. Staff were told from day one, speak only when spoken to. Do not make eye contact with the Führer. Do not ask questions, ever. Elizabeth didn't understand everything, but she felt everything. The tension in the hallways, the eyes of guards who watched her every move, the eerie quiet during meals. It was like living in a pressure chamber. She was 17, surrounded by uniformed men, isolated on a mountain. No phone calls, no letters, just rules, and the sound of footsteps that could vanish overnight. And in that moment, Elizabeth knew this wasn't a job. This was something else entirely, and there was no turning back. Inside the Berghof, nothing felt real. Every surface was polished to perfection. Every movement was measured. The smell of fresh bread drifted through marble hallways, while some of the darkest decisions in modern history were being made just a few doors away. Elizabeth quickly learned the unspoken rules. Don't speak unless spoken to. Don't walk too fast. Don't linger. Never ask questions. Never ever look directly at the Führer. Even the most innocent mistake, a dish placed slightly wrong, a word uttered too loudly, could lead to punishment. Or worse, disappearance. It wasn't just strict, it was surreal. The Berghof operated like a high-functioning machine built on silence and fear. Staff whispered in corners, used hand signals more than voices. Eyes were always watching. Guards didn't just protect the estate, they monitored everything. Even laughter felt dangerous. Each morning began the same. Uniforms perfectly ironed, shoes shined, beds tucked like blueprints. Elizabeth would walk past antique furniture and looted paintings on her way to set the dining table, where meals were served to Nazi leaders like Goebbels and Himmler. Their boots clicked on polished floors. Their eyes swept the room like searchlights. There was no room for error. Every item had a place. Hitler's preferences were gospel: lukewarm water, food cut just so, dishes tasted by others first. The kitchen was a battlefield of precision. Every spoon, every glass, every folded napkin was a potential test. And if something went wrong, it didn't matter whose fault it was, anyone could be blamed. Elizabeth watched staff members vanish without explanation. One day, a maid was folding sheets beside her. The next, her room was empty. No goodbye, no mention, as if she'd never existed. It happened so often, everyone learned to move more slowly, to breathe more carefully. Fear sharpened every moment. Even when Hitler wasn't in the room, his presence saturated the air. People adjusted their posture instinctively. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Jokes died in throats. Every minute felt like walking a tightrope strung over fire. Behind the pristine curtains, something darker thrived. Maps were spread across. Tables. Names were crossed off lists. Ash sometimes clung to uniforms that had been spotless minutes before. Elizabeth didn't know all the meanings then, but she knew enough to be afraid. She didn't have the language for it at the time, but she was living in a fortress of paranoia, a place where fear wasn't a side effect. It was the operating system, where power meant control and silence meant survival. This wasn't just housekeeping. This was frontline exposure to a collapsing empire, one plate, one glance, one breath at a time. At first, Elizabeth thought the tension inside the Berghof was just strict discipline. But over time, something changed. The polished routines began to crack. The silence wasn't just control anymore, it was fear. And the man at the center of it all, Adolf Hitler, was starting to fall apart. She didn't have access to war briefings or classified documents, but she didn't need them. The truth was leaking through the walls, through arguments, absences, and the strange way uniforms were sometimes stained with ash, even when no one had stepped outside. It started with the staff. They vanished, not all at once, just one by one. A cook gone, a gardener missing. A maid who folded laundry beside Elizabeth on Monday was gone by Wednesday. No goodbye, no explanation. Their names were never spoken again. Everyone noticed. No one said a word. Because inside the Berghof, you didn't ask questions. You just worked faster, quieter, more carefully. You made yourself invisible. And behind the walls, she began hearing things. Raised voices late at night. Familiar names, Goebbels, Himmler, Speer shouting just beyond the hallway. One night, she remembers hearing 3 of them, arguing, panicked. She couldn't make out every word, but one phrase she never forgot. "If the Allies find out..." That was the night she realized something enormous was unraveling. The Führer himself was changing. Hitler, once the towering presence in every room, had become pale and twitchy. His hands shook. He muttered to himself. His footsteps, once firm, now dragged. He obsessed over routine. Meals had to be timed to the second, rooms arranged to exact symmetry. Windows opened at a precise angle. More alarming were the injections. Elizabeth didn't know what was inside the syringes, but she saw the change after each visit from his personal doctor. His voice would slur, his eyes would dull. Sometimes he'd grow hyperactive, then crash into exhaustion hours later. It wasn't discipline. It was dependence. He flinched at sudden sounds. He hated cold water. He demanded that even his napkins be folded identically each day. The man, who had once commanded armies, now feared the wrong fold, the wrong word, the wrong glance. There were entire days where Hitler didn't leave his room. The man who once delivered thunderous speeches now muttered to himself in a dimly lit study. Elizabeth would pass the door and hear fragments, repeated phrases, paranoid outbursts, names of generals spoken like curses. Sometimes he was silent, for hours. Sometimes he ranted for minutes on end, to no one. Elizabeth began to understand. The war outside was coming in. Hitler wasn't just losing ground in Europe, he was losing control of his world and of himself. There was a weight in the air, like something terrible was always about to happen. People moved like ghosts. Conversations became grunts. Orders were barked, not spoken. And when the Allies advanced, the Berghof's tension didn't break. It exploded. Elizabeth remembers the sound of boots running, doors slamming. Orders screamed across the hallway. Smoke began to fill the rooms. Flames licked at the walls. The Berghof was burning. She ran, through smoke, past paintings stolen from murdered families, past the crystal chandeliers and the ornate rugs. No one stopped her. No one gave her instructions. The empire was collapsing, and she was escaping the wreckage in real time. She didn't know it then, but that run through fire would be the beginning of her silence. The moment when the maid who saw too much began to carry history's heaviest burden, alone. Elizabeth had been warned about many things at the Berghof: silence, obedience, rules. But no one warned her about Eva Braun. To the outside world, Eva was invisible, a mystery. Hitler's rumored companion hidden in shadows, rarely mentioned, never official. But inside the Berghof, she was very real, and she was always watching. When Elizabeth first met her, she seemed harmless, friendly even. Eva greeted the younger maids with compliments and smiles. She asked about their families. She offered advice on hairstyles. It felt like warmth, but that warmth was calculated. Eva Braun didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She didn't need to. She ran the Berghof with subtle control, choosing the curtains, arranging flowers, setting staff schedules, inspecting uniforms. Nothing moved without her knowledge. She wasn't the general, but she was the governor of the atmosphere. Elizabeth soon realized kindness from Eva was not a gift. It was a warning that you were being noticed. Eva was elegant, always perfectly dressed. Her jewelry was extravagant: necklaces, brooches, bracelets that shimmered even in low light. Later, Elizabeth learned many of those pieces were likely stolen from Jewish families during Nazi raids. But at the Berghof, they were just part of the decor. While cities burned and families starved, Eva posed for home movies, arranged tea parties, and laughed at cocktail hours with men who would later be tried for war crimes. She dined on gourmet meals while outside the gates, millions suffered. But she wasn't ignorant. She was in the rooms. She heard the names. She saw the same maps, the same visitors, the same tension Elizabeth did. She wasn't unaware, she was insulated. And she used that insulation to craft a world that made death feel ordinary. One of the most chilling truths Elizabeth came to understand was Eva's role as emotional regulator. When Eva was cheerful, the house felt safe. When she was cold, staff held their breath. When she disappeared, panic set in. She didn't speak for Hitler, but her mood spoke volumes. Even Hitler listened to her. She was one of the few who could interrupt him mid-sentence without punishment. That power wasn't loud, but it was real. It gave her influence that generals envied, and she wielded it behind curtains, not podiums. To the public, Eva Braun was a footnote. To those inside the Berghof, she was something else entirely. The smiling shadow of power, the woman who made tyranny look civilized. When Elizabeth escaped the Berghof as it burned, she didn't celebrate. She didn't cry out in relief. She didn't even look back. She ran with smoke in her lungs, ash on her shoes, and silence already forming in her throat. The war was ending, but for her, something else was beginning. A lifetime of silence. She returned to Austria and tried to live an ordinary life, but nothing felt ordinary after what she had seen. She never told her friends. She avoided reporters. Even her own family knew only fragments. Whenever questions arose, she changed the subject. Because the truth was still dangerous. In post-war Europe, survivors were everywhere. But not all stories were welcomed. Elizabeth hadn't been a victim or a soldier. She hadn't fought. She hadn't resisted. She had served quietly, carefully, in the belly of the beast, and she had survived. That survival came at a cost. For decades, she carried memories that had no outlet, rooms filled with secrets, names etched into her mind, the sound of Hitler's voice behind a locked door, the quiet tension before an outburst, the flicker of fear on a general's face. And so, she remained silent. But then, as her 100th birthday approached, something shifted. Maybe it was the weight of time. Maybe it was the fear that her truth would die with her. Whatever it was, Elizabeth made a decision. Before she left this world, she would speak. And when she did, the world listened. Her story spread fast, through newspapers, documentaries, and digital archives. Not because she was famous, not because she had power, but because she had been there, she had seen, she had remembered, and finally, she had told the truth. Historians called it one of the most important civilian accounts of Hitler's inner world ever recorded, not because it exposed new facts, but because it exposed new feelings. The atmosphere of collapse, the culture of fear, the slow disintegration of control from the inside out. Elizabeth Kalhammer didn't change history with a weapon. She changed it with memory. And by finally breaking her silence, she helped complete the record of a regime that thrived on people staying quiet.